Thank you for logging in to Hidden Histories, URBAN-15's online cultural magazine from here in San Antonio, Texas. Tonight, we're going to be featuring what I would consider one of the stamps of approval and acceptance and recognition by the entire world when San Antonio once hosted a World's Fair in 1968. Hidden Histories is providing URBAN-15 and our audiences an opportunity to hear, present, propose, and suggest stories that you just don't find in most of the other media around this area. There are stories of families, stories of culture, stories of politics, business, but it really is all about family. So if you have some ideas about a Hidden Histories project, contact us. Ask us at hiddenhistories.tv. One of the parts of our show that we enjoy quite a bit is what we call found images. And tonight, in keeping with the theme of HemisFair, we're going to show you some 8mm footage that was shot during the HemisFair years. So thank you very much. Stay in touch with us and enjoy the 3 minutes. Okay, tonight's key feature is former employees and very young age, and they're 18 through 21 years old or so, whose lives were formulated, influenced, and really forged in their professional careers as they continue here in San Antonio. The impact of HemisFair is incredibly large, and we're just starting to create the dialogue where we can discuss the pros, the cons, the positives, the negatives, and the enormous opportunity it still allows us to create dialogue. So we have chosen the guest curator, Becky Barrera, and she has chosen friends with whom she was an employee at HemisFair during 1968. Have fun tonight. Let us know your stories. You can send us imagery, or you can send us audio tapes or whatever using the find us at hiddenhistories.tv. Okay, so Becky, it's your show.
Thank you so much. I love this name, HemisFair, a stamp in time, and it just erupted one day when we were visiting because, you know, when you think about, you put a date stamp on something, you stamp it, you think, okay, it's permanently right there. But the magical thing about HemisFair is that it continues to make its mark on San Antonio through the decades and the last 50 years that have gone by, even though HemisFair only lasted 6 months. So we're coming up on the 50th anniversary, and we're thrilled to be here and share this information with you. So during today's program, we're going to focus on the lasting effect of HemisFair on our city, on our economic goals and opportunities, on the faces of the people who worked in the fair, and the many young people who drove the monorail. They hosted events for millions of visitors. They gave information at the information booth, and all of the things that happened, the great adventures that we had during that summer. Now, this was a tumultuous year with the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King, and a month later, Bobby Kennedy. It was the time of the Chicano walkouts at Edgewood and Crystal City. It was a time of civil riots and people demanding attention, even at the level of the Democratic Party at their convention. And of course, there were all the Vietnam protests. So people were concerned. It was a crazy time. And in those 6 months, San Antonio put all its energy, all its power into creating this festival that was positive. It was exciting. It was to share the capacity of its culture and to learn from the other cultures that came from around the world. So let's get started. Our first topic of the day is the transformation of a neighborhood. And with me are Anastasia Bueno and Abby Cottrell, both who were official HemisFair VIP guides. And Anastasia, how did you get your job, and what were you doing that brought you to HemisFair?
Well, I was a student at St. Mary's University. I was a junior. And we heard around campus that it was going to be about $2 or $3 to get into the fair every day. So they said, but if you get a job, you get a badge. If you get a badge, and you can go every day, or that you're not working. And so the tricky part was that I had to figure out how to maintain my status as a student deferment from having a student deferment with the Vietnam War. So.
Well, the same thing happened to me. I was living in the dorm at Incarnate Word, and unless you maintained 12 hours minimum, you couldn't live in the dorm. So I had to move out because I only carried 6 hours that semester. Abby, what were you doing, and how did you come to the fair?
I had just graduated from the University of Texas with a degree in French and Italian, and I had returned home to my family's home in the Panhandle with no plan for how to use that degree. And my father, who subscribed to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, was reading the paper shortly after I came back home, and he learned I had no plan. And he said, wait, look, they're interviewing people in Austin, bilingual guides for a World's Fair that's going to be in San Antonio. They're interviewing tomorrow. So he took the family car keys, handed them to me, and said, go.
And that was
and I did. I interviewed for the position of VIP guide, and here I here I came.
And all of us were bilingual, and that was just a really important part of our work. We had to have a driver's license so we could take people in different places. Sometimes we drove limos, sometimes we drove golf carts.
Golf
We did lots
carts.
of things. But let's talk about the fair just a little bit, how it came to be. I understand that Jerome Harris, who was a clothing merchant, was really concerned that San Antonio's economy was not in a good shape. And he wanted to sell, of course, the things in his department store. So he suggested to the Chamber of Commerce in 1958, the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce, that they hold a trade fair and that we invite the country of Mexico and people from other states to come and see what we had in Texas. And it just didn't fly. The idea was there, people looked at it, they thought it was okay, they just couldn't figure out how to make it happen. But in 1962, 4 years later, Henry B. Gonzalez jumped on that idea. He was the newly elected congressman, and he said, we need to do something about this, and we need to make it even bigger than that idea. Let's see what we can do. Anastasia, how did Henry B. look at it, and what did he do? Was he able to pull off that idea?
Well, it was his idea, but he had a friend named Bill Sinkin, who was a banker, and I think he had retail stores as well. Anyway, and many friends, political friends, in San Antonio. And so he's the one that came with the idea of having a HemisFair. And not only that, but he was pretty much responsible for the theme, which was magnificent. It was called The Confluence of Civilizations in the Americas. If you look at that logo or my little badge that yours too, shows how they came from one civilization came from the east and mixed with the one in the Americas.
Right.
And so he and both of them were responsible for that. But you have a story about Jerome Harris, don't you, about the clothing store. He was correct, because in the 40s and in the 50s, San Antonio the economy was just stagnant. And not only that, but to add to that, was that the perception of San Antonio was this nice, sleepy town.
Right.
And sometimes that did not play well with our image, across, especially because
this was a poor and sleepy, quiet little town.
That was the perception.
But we were going to have to raise about $156 million, which was the budget for the fair. How on earth were they going to find that kind of money to build the fair? Either of you?
Well, I mean, I just want to add to that, because part of what Bill Sinkin also did and contributed to raising the money that they needed was there were two political groups at the time, one conservative, one liberal.
Right.
And somebody said they hated each other. Well, they really didn't like each other. But it was Bill Sinkin who knew both groups.
Parties, the mayor and
yes,
congressman.
and you talk about confluence of civilizations. We had a confluence of a community, and he
Exactly.
got them together, and so everybody bought into it, including bankers and the other economic sectors.
Right.
And
And,
that gave them the
initially,
impetus.
there were, I think, 26 banks that kicked in the money for the feasibility study to make it really get started. But there were other business leaders who invested in HemisFair, weren't there?
There were several sources of income for the fair. They had maybe 400 or more businesses who invested in the fair. And they also had municipal bonds that covered things like the Tower of the Americas, the Convention Center, the
Right.
arena.
So the people of San Antonio
The
voted.
people of San Antonio
to create that.
voted to support the fair.
Right.
And
But wasn't there a
they
promise by
also
Mayor
had-
McAllister that it wouldn't cost the citizens a penny? That it would all pay for
That
itself?
sounds right, yes.
They
Sounds
hoped
like it.
they hoped they
That
wouldn't
sounds
have to
right.
pay for anything.
A
Sounds
big
like a banker.
promise. But they also had they used the umbrella of urban renewal to do eminent domain. When they decided on the place, the site, they were going to have to purchase it. And that's
And
when
that's where the money
when
was gonna
they
be used for
yes,
that.
that's when the
So I read in Sterling Helmsley's book, HemisFair 68 and the Transformation of San Antonio, he conducted interviews of some of these men who were involved in the investment. And one of them was Red McCombs. And Red McCombs was charged with finding all the corporate exhibitors because there still had to be a trade fair kind of element to the fair. And these corporate exhibitors would bring the futuristic things to the people so that everyone could see what a car would look like, 20 years down the line, or telephones with pictures, things like that. Computers, they're things we didn't know very well in 1968. And so he was working to get Lee Iacocca to bring Ford Motor Company in, buy one of the buildings, build it, staff it, spend a bunch of money here in San Antonio, and become part of the fair. And Lee Iacocca would have nothing of it. He was a very strong CEO, and he was very good watchdog of the Henry Ford Company. So after a while, Red McCombs panicked because his time was going by and he hadn't been able to find the money or find the vendors, the exhibitors. So he called Governor Connolly and said, I'm having a problem with Lee Iacocca. He thinks San Antonio is not worth coming to. And Governor Connolly said, don't you worry about that. I'm going to call LBJ. And at that time, Lyndon B. Johnson was president of the United States. So Connolly called him, and he called Henry Ford.
Yes.
And the next thing you know, Henry Ford is cutting ribbon in San Antonio at the HemisFair. So as a result of this kind of involvement by businesses, we were able to build two really amazing, iconic buildings, I would say, very, very quickly, in addition to the convention center. One of the things that popped out, we saw it earlier in the video, which, by the way, that video was charming. To see Super 8 was what we used in 1968, and to see all those things come to life, I just loved that. It was wonderful. So one of them was, of course, the Hilton Palacio del Rio. We all saw it being built. Again, that was a private investment by the Mr. Zachary.
H.B. Zachary.
H.B. Zachary. And so you watched it being built. What did you know about that tower? I mean, that hotel.
That hotel. Well, what was interesting is that it was like building blocks, but there were rooms, completely furnished, all the plumbing, everything in there.
With beds in them and everything.
Everything, all furnished. And then they would bring out H.B. Zachary had they were built out of his yard at the Fort.
On the south side.
On the south side, 35 in Southwest and Military. And so anyway, and then they would bring them in, actually brought them with police escorts. So, it was like a big event. And then they would take them with a crane and just build them, lift them and put them in place like little building blocks, all the way up.
Wow. And of course, the other great building, it still functions today. It's a
Yes, it
beautiful
does.
centerpiece for our river. Another wonderful building that came through with the work of these people working together was the Tower of the Americas. And the other day we walked there, and you had some thoughts about what the tower meant to you. Let's see if we have some footage about that.
My memories of HemisFair involving the Tower of the Americas was actually before the fair ever opened. And we saw the actual building, first of the concrete tower, and then the most interesting part was when they built the top house, I think that's what they called it, at the bottom, just the frame, and then with hydraulics, they lifted it all the way up to the top. And then when it hit the top, all the bells in San Antonio, all the sirens, everything went off. And, that was a big, celebration. What was amazing to me as well, first time I went there, I didn't know, well, they told us, but I had forgotten that part of it rotates, the top house, where the restaurant is. So I was getting kind of a little dizzy the first time that I was there. And then if you didn't know where you were, you'd lose track of where the restroom was, because if you went to the restroom, you came in and you knew where it was, and then 15 minutes later, it wasn't there anymore, because the thing had rotated.
So these buildings were built in this neighborhood, and the neighborhood was chosen as part of an urban renewal project, because that's the only way they could take a whole chunk of land and convert it into a fair. So it was 92.6 acres, plus they widened South Alamo, and then we created Interstate 37 on the back. So if this was a neighborhood, then how were these buildings built, Abby? What did they do?
Well, it was a neighborhood of over 2,000 residents, and it was a viable neighborhood, a mixture of cultures of German, Alsatian, Mexican American, African American. They had a Catholic church, St. Michael's. They had a Jewish temple,
Oh, my.
and they had they had restaurants. It was a wonderful neighborhood according to the people who lived there. So they knew they were going to they only had $12 million to purchase the site, to buy all of the homes, over 200 homes.
But if people lived there, why would they want to leave?
Well, many of them didn't. And one particular family, well, because it was urban renewal and because they had devalued the homes from their market value, the families were told they could either sell their homes at the asking price or they would be evicted. So most families gave in and sold their homes and left. 1,600 people left and never returned. One particular family I think you might call collateral damage for HemisFair, and that was the Frank Tudus family. They had been in their home on 123 Wyoming for 52 years. Mr. Tudus had been there 52 years. He was born there. His great-grandfather had built the home. There was no reason for him to want to leave. And so he refused the offer. He said, no, I'm not going to move. And they condemned it, and before the fair in 1965, I think, they came to his house and broke in the door and physically removed the family from the home. And Mr. Tudus fought it for the rest of his life. They offered him the $10,000 again in a court settlement, and he said, no, I'll never take it, because then I could not keep fighting. So he left and never came back, and he moved to the south side of town, very close to the San Antonio River. So he stayed near his beloved river, and as I say, I think he was the collateral damage for a wonderful fair that benefited San Antonio, but at what cost?
So we had a few buildings that stayed after the fair, and these, of course, are the convention center, which looks different now because we don't have an arena anymore. And the arena is the reason we have the Spurs, wouldn't you say?
No, yeah,
Absolutely.
because we
had
needed
no
a venue
place
of
for
that
them.
size, right?
Exactly. We have the Instituto Cultural de Mexico, which continued and stayed on the grounds and continued to provide cultural services after the fair closed. And then about 25 years later, the Beethoven Hall became a Magic Theater. And we'll hear a little bit more about that later. So the lasting impact then of these businesses and and enterprises, it cost people their homes, their neighborhood. But on the other hand, there was a new beginning for San Antonio. We had a new tourist industry. We had new businesses. I always hear the story about how Church's Fried Chicken came about. It started out as a little kiosk down over near the Alamo, and during the fair they opened and had little stores everywhere, and it just exploded after that. There were other businesses as well. Abby, you recall one or two of them?
Well, I would think most people in San Antonio have eaten at Paisano's Italian restaurant. Well, Nick Pacelli and Joe Kaziak came for HemisFair from Canada, and they liked San Antonio so much they said, we'll stay. And so they opened their little Italian restaurant, Paisano's, first on McCullough, and now there's one out by the Quarry Market and one on the north side.
And one on the river.
And one on the river, that's right. So, but the other person that contributed and still contributes to San Antonio is Justin Arecki, who came from New York to work at the fair. He actually was the manager of the Golden Garter. And when the fair was over, he said, I'll stay. So he took his Golden Garter to the river, and it was the garter on the river.
Right.
But then he eventually sold that and opened an Italian gelato place called Justin's Ice Cream on the river. And I think it was a wonderful contribution
And
to
of
San
course,
Antonio.
the hotels that came as well as these people who came from out of town.
Joe
La
Bar-
Quinta,
Phil and,
Was
and Sam
Sam
Barshop
Barshop.
opened La Quinta,
And
which
of
they
course
never
we-
thought would be a series of
Of
La
hotels.
Quintas. But
And
it
now
grew,
it's a
and
major
now
business
it's a major
now.
business.
Well,
yeah.
thank you both so much for sharing this information.
Thank you.
And we're going to move on to our next topic now, which is HemisFair 68 and the cultural awakening of San Antonio. So this part of the show, we're going to talk about this idea of the confluence of civilizations, how you bring people together from Europe, from the East, and they came to the West, and they mixed and they found new pathways, and it created this beautiful logo that became the symbol of HemisFair. And for us to be able to enjoy that confluence, we created at HemisFair exhibits, entertainment, events, and we invited people from all over the world to come. So 2 more young people at the time that were at HemisFair, Pat Barnes and Robin Raquet. Pat, what were you doing at that time? And
I was in college and I was looking for a part-time job. And of course, the whole city knew that HemisFair was coming. So my father had a neighbor that said, listen, I know a guy, they're interviewing for press aides. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, you would help all the visiting press that was expected to come to the fair. So I said, this is great. I could go to the fair every day. I could meet influential and famous people and get paid for it. So I said, I got to have this job. So I went and I interviewed, got the job. About a dozen of us did. Trained for about a month, and then the fair opened and the magnificent adventure began.
that's fabulous. And Robin, what were you doing at the time?
Well, I had just graduated from Texas Tech with degrees in Spanish and in English Lit, and I didn't have a clue where I was going. I just knew I probably didn't want to be a school teacher.
Hey.
Turns out I was a pretty good teacher after a while, but so I saw the ad in the newspaper, and they were looking for bilingual VIP guides, official guides, whose duties would be to help with the different ceremonies and to drive VIPs around in little golf carts. And we manned the information booths, and we were just kind of like the local authorities on all the important things. So that's how it started.
grand. So, Pat, you said you met a bunch of VIPs.
I did.
First, were they dignitaries? Were they celebrities? Were they entertainers? Who did you meet?
Celebrities, mostly entertainers and famous press people.
Like
But
who did you meet?
Well,
What
the entertainers,
entertainers?
they all came through the press center eventually.
Right.
So, but like Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Louis Armstrong, Roy
You
Clark.
know, there's people who don't know who they are
Well,
anymore.
and you know, I'm really going to feel old when I say the Mills brothers and the Osmond brothers and.
Wait, the Osmonds, people know Donnie and Marie Osmond.
But you know, they have 6 of them, 6 brothers.
And so
plus
Donnie and Marie were,
Marie was too little to come, but the 6 brothers and Dad came, and they were the
Okay.
nicest, most well-behaved kids you could possibly imagine.
really,
Yeah.
of course. How wonderful.
So I really got to meet and get close to most of them.
And Robin, who were some of the VIPs that you met?
Well, 68 was a big political year, so we had a lot of the candidates come through. We had, of course, Lady Bird and President Johnson came, and the Connollys. Then we had Spiro Agnew, who later became a famous character, and Nelson Rockefeller. But my favorite was Hubert Humphrey, because he was so nice and jovial. And so the day that he came to the fair, they declared it to be Minnesota Day, and he participated in a cow milking contest.
What a good sport.
Yeah.
That's
was fun.
really fun. How wonderful. And so every night there was a performance at the Lila Cockrell Theater or in the arena,
That's right.
as well as
Absolutely.
on the grounds. I understand that that's when Vicki Carr got her big boost and took off and became beloved in San Antonio.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then after that, of course, her life transformed as well. Robin, you became very close friends with one of the families that was here. The whole family performed.
I did. They were called the Mora Arriaga family from Monterrey. Charming family, mom and dad, and then about, I think, 8 kids, the youngest of whom was about 6 years old. You can see him on the screen. Levy was the little one. And so we hung out with them as much as we could. And after the fair was over, Anastasio and Lilia and I decided to take a trip to Monterey, and we stayed a weekend with them, and
That's
it
grand.
was a wonderful time.
These are permanent friendships that were born out of the
They're
fair.
still around, they're still playing, and they're still producing records and CDs, and they're out of Miami now, Mora Arriaga.
I wish we could bring them to the fair
Exactly.
celebration. So besides the famous people that came, there were things to see. There were exhibits and pavilions. So there were corporate exhibits, weren't there? And exhibits where you could see a futuristic car. I remember the telephones that had a picture in it. And now, of course, everybody has cameras in their phones. But 50 years ago, that was a very big deal. What other corporate or exhibits that you remember were important?
Every time I took a group on tour, when they finished, I always said, what did you like? What was your favorite thing? And 99% always said the Frito-Lay Pepsi pavilion or exhibit with the flying Indians. You know?
Okay, so those are the voladores de
Well,
Papantla.
yeah.
And why was that so special?
Well, for one thing, it's a little shocking, the sacrificial virgin that they used for a certain time came out topless.
Oh, so she was topless. Yes,
For a
I
while,
remember
until
that.
the authorities said,
Yeah,
no,
said,
that's
no,
not
we're
good."
not gonna, it's not gonna fly. She had to put on a nude leotard or something.
Yeah.
Well, also there was a ceremony in the early days where they would sacrifice a chicken and spill blood on the ground before they started. Now, this is one of those things that is confusing to a lot of people who are not familiar with these ancient rituals. This was not a performance. This was for them a religious ceremony, and every day they prayed before they flew, and it's a very dangerous thing. That pole is super high, and they stood on top and blew that pipe and danced up there and then tied those ropes, and you described it so well.
I did. It had to do with the unwinding, had to do with the progress of the year, so that each revolution coming down represented, a period of time. And the little stage they were on, all, 5 of them, was only about this big.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
it was just incredible.
Pretty
But,
amazing.
to go back to the performers, we had not only people like the Osmonds and Mora Arriaga, but we had Bolshoi Ballet, we
Right.
had Man of La Mancha, we had Puccini Opera. So it was really
Right.
something for everybody.
It was extraordinary, and we, as fair employees, could always get free tickets when there was empty seats. They would pass them out, so we would fill the auditorium. It was great. It was a great summer, is all I can say.
it was.
So there were also countries represented, not just these kinds of exhibits. And the countries came from, well, they were all over the world. What can you tell? They brought their food, they brought their talent, they brought displays. Robin, what kind of countries came?
All of the European countries, France and Germany, Portugal, the Netherlands, all the Central American states, the OAS. But our favorite pavilion was always Spain, because once a month they would change out and have a new flamenco troupe come to perform, and they were out of this world. Plus there were these bands of students called estudiantinas from the colleges that would have these long, beautiful black robes with ribbons all hanging off. They were kind of like troubadours.
The ribbons are given to them when they take a serenade to a young lady. So she gives them a ribbon and they pin it.
Oh,
and
neat.
and they're embroidered with the name of the person who gave them to them. I myself have given a few away.
All right.
So, those were, the Spanish pavilion was just grand. But in addition to that, there was great food, and there were street entertainers. Who met Bongo Joe? Who remembers Bongo Joe?
I do.
Became a San Antonio icon.
Yeah, he stayed after the fair
He
too,
did.
didn't he?
He
What
was
do
this
you
crazy
remember
guy. You
about?
can see him in the picture. He had these big old steel drums, and he had a little whistle. He had a harmonica, and all kinds of
And he-
percussion
yeah,
instruments.
and he
would whistle
it's a
and make up
whole-
songs, and
great.
just raconteur, talking back and forth with the audience.
Yeah.
So and he was around for years after
Oh, yeah.
that, performing
He
down
was
on the
terrific.
river.
So there were some other cultural experiences as well. Do you recall the sculptures, the art pieces that were around the fair?
Absolutely. Over 120 high quality avant-garde sculptures were were situated around the park. Alexander Calder had a piece. Bill Briscoe from San Antonio had these wonderful bird sculptures in the fountains. And my favorite fountain was called the Peacock Fountain, and it had long jets of water shooting out and making a big ball. So lots and lots of pictures taken in front of that fountain. And then talking about the different foreign pavilions, Mexico is our principal foreign pavilion, of course.
They were the first.
They were the first to sign up, and actually, it was because of Mexico that we only had the fair for 6 months' time, because the Olympics were going to be starting up in Mexico in October. And so we had planned for a year's worth, and they said, no, we need, if you want us to participate in HemisFair, then it needs to be cut off in October. Mm-hmm. But in Mexico Pavilion, you had this gigantic tree of life sculpture. You had these wonderful pre-Columbian sculptures from different objects from the old days, little clowns and little dogs.
And don't forget the giant Olmec heads that were outside.
Oh, and the giant Olmec
it's
head.
still there. That's a wonderful piece of art
It
to
was.
look at.
And the
Olmecs are even older than the Aztecs and the Toltecs and other Maya groups.
Early Maya group.
Those great big beautiful heads.
And one of the most fascinating pavilions was Encanto de un Pueblo, which was the work of Alexander Gerard from Santa Fe. He collected hundreds of thousands of little folk art objects and put them in dioramas, one after the other. And Richard is going to tell you all about that a little bit later.
Well, it sounds like HemisFair was as much fun for you as it was for me. I remember Argyle the Snake insulting everyone. The Rainbow Bread had contributed this truck, this old bread truck, and painted I think it's the one we used on the cover photo. You and I are dancing in front of it. And Argyle would pop out of this window and he'd just start yelling at people across the audience. Hey, you with the hat on, cover that face up too. He'd say stuff like that. He was insulting everyone. And the one person I heard that loved him the most was Lady Bird. She would just come and fire barbs right back at him. And that was great. So there were puppets, there were marching bands, there were parades. This was a great time. I wonder if each of you will close this section out by summarizing your best memory and one story that really stands out in your mind.
I will say this, that being at HemisFair set me on a life course for the people I met and the contacts I met, that set me on a life course that would have never happened in a million years, or I could have dreamed of without HemisFair.
And you had a lot of fun with it too.
A lot of fun.
I heard that you took the Baja Marimba band to the airport.
They opened for Jack Benny, and when they were finished, their gig, so to speak, they had an early morning flight, Sunday morning flight back to Los Angeles. So we got them in the car, and musicians don't like early mornings. But we got out there and found out there was an hour delay. So rather than sit around and drink coffee, they opened up their instrument cases and they had a 30-minute concert right there at the terminal, San Antonio Airport, early Sunday morning.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And the other passengers must have been just delighted.
Everybody in the terminal was like, what is this? A free concert.
That's fabulous. Robin, do you have one special memory and story that stands out for you, or how it affected your life? Can you share that with us?
Well, the other art pavilion I was going to mention was done by Yusef Karsh, the premier black and white photographer who did all those fabulous portraits of famous people over the years. I was a neophyte photographer with my little brownie box at that time, but he really got me inspired. And I remember one story was he had the perfect portrait of Winston Churchill. And the way he got that image was Winston Churchill gave him 4 minutes to take this shot. And so what he did was he just walked over there and grabbed his cigar out of his hand, and so Winston Churchill went like that. That's how come that shot got to be.
So what happened at the end of your work day every day?
Well, we never wanted to leave. So after a long day working really, really hard, we would just change out of our uniforms into play clothes and hang out at HemisFair. A lot of the time we were at the Sir John Falstaff Pavilion drinking Falstaff beer and listening to Lofton Klein, or doing other stuff around the fair. We never left until the place closed down.
It was wonderful. We partied all the time. Yep. Thank you both so much for sharing these stories with us. We're going to turn now to other young faces of HemisFair. These were experiences that are incomparable. I don't think that you could ever have an experience anywhere that would match what happened at HemisFair. So welcome to the table, Susie Monday, Richard Rosen, and Anastasio's back to talking to us again. So Anastasia, we're gonna since you already started, we're gonna let them tell us who they are first, and then you're gonna start telling stories. Susie, tell us what you were doing about that time and how you got your job.
Well, I was a young student at Trinity University. I think I was a sophomore, and I had been teaching in the children's theater program. I'd really come to Trinity with Paul Baker and Janine Wagner from Waco, Texas. But I ended up working in Project Y, and Project Y was just an amazing happening for the whole
How fabulous.
community.
Lucky you. And Richard, what were you doing at the time, and how did you end up?
Well, I
at the
was
fair?
a student at Trinity. I was a senior.
Oh, so did you all know each other?
We've known each other for a long time.
Oh, how about that?
And I decided to take off. I fell in love and decided to take off for a while from school and went to New York and ran out of money within 2 or 3 days. I didn't have much to start with, so decided to come back, and some friends of mine, Lawrence Miller, and he was one of the cultural heads, and Pick Swartz, and a whole bunch of people said, would you like a job? And I said, sure, if I don't have to go back to school, I'll take anything. And so they offered me a job at HemisFair, and I worked at 2 different places during the fair. One is at Confluence Cosmos, which was in
Which
the
we have a
convention
banner
center.
right here from Confluence
Yeah.
Cosmos.
And there were a bunch of us Trinity students that were technical, the people that did technical things. They found out later that I didn't, so they moved me.
And your
But
second job
my
was?
second job was managing the Alexander Gerard Pavilion, which
Oh,
was,
that's
she's already
wonderful.
spoken about the El Encanto de Pueblo.
We're going to have to hear more about that in a
Yeah.
minute. Anastasio, let's get back to you. We met you earlier. Tell us one great story about your work as a HemisFair guide.
Well, you got an opportunity to do many things other than just manning, information booths, which we did. But got to take folks around and got to take out celebrities. And
Like?
I had quite a few, but the one that stands out the most, that I remember the most, was the Prince and Princess of Monaco. It was Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier. And I was sent to pick them up in a limo and
Nice.
at the place where they were staying in this mansion. It's called the Chester Luther Mansion. And when you walk into the play, it's gigantic. It's like 40 by 40 foyer, and it's like 3 stories high, it looked like. And it had this circular staircase, and all along the floor and the circular staircase, it was saltillo tile. And so I was looking at, because I was there early, and then they didn't show up when they were supposed to, so I'm looking out the door, the little glass that's there on the door, and I heard the thump of stilettos.
Stilettos
I
on
thought,
the tile.
oh, my God. And so I turned around, and it was the princess. And she was wearing a black outfit, and that blonde hair was up in the chongo, And I just watched her walk down. It was like yesterday. I just watched her walk all the way down. And so
And what did you think when you saw her?
I don't know you that well. No. No, I just thought, to me, I guess the only thing I could think of today is she was the most devastatingly beautiful female I have ever seen. Oh. And she came up to me and she said, "Are you the person that's supposed to take us down to Callison Western Wear?" Because that's where I was going to take them. They were going to buy some Western garb. And I said, "Yes, Your Highness." And she says, "Well, I want to apologize to you for being late." And I thought, Mike. And then she said, "And I want to apologize for my husband."
Have any of your other tours apologized for being late?
Man, they were late and they didn't apologize. So she from that moment on, it was like, first of all, my knees got kind of rattly when she's telling me all this, because throughout the whole 2 days that I had her, and then my friend Ronnie Cosgrove had her the other 2 days, that kind of tone and that kind of tenor and that kind of kindness was how she talked
That's how
to me.
she was. She was beautiful.
And she was beautiful.
So what a
She could
soul.
act.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
What's that?
She could act too.
Oh, yeah, she was an actress, yeah, but I wasn't going all that.
So, what about your work, Susie? Tell us a little bit about Project Y, because these other services were provided to people, and people just came and observed. But at Project Y, people became part of the fair. They interacted in a different way. Tell us what Project Y was about.
Well, Project Y was the youth pavilion, and it kind of was a late arrival to the fair, but we young people who ran it were given a lot of power and a lot of authority and a lot of ways to interact creatively with people at the fair. This was, as you said, the 60s. This was the time of happenings, which I hope everybody knows what a happening was, but it's a free-flowing event with expression and communication and
Looking at the
passionate
slides.
thought. So when we did things like wall messages to your world, and people would come in from the fair and be able to write their graffiti on the wall. We had musicians, both local and out of town. That's where I met George Cisneros. He was one of the young musicians who performed at Project Y. Leadbelly performed. And for example, the first day, the opening day of the fair, we had a baker from Los Angeles who built a 50-foot long oven, and everybody who came into the exhibit helped to bake the bread and make the bread and break bread together. And we also sent off, I think this was before we knew they were not environmentally sound, about 1,000 red balloons on opening, helium balloons that went up past the top of the tower. They were just magnificent.
What a fun job. And you were much younger than the rest of us, weren't you?
Not that much. I was 18.
Well, yeah, we were all teenagers.
You were all a little older, but I was running a program for the fair children. Parents could sign their kids in for an hour and a half, 2 hours for activities.
Can you imagine doing that today, that somebody would just drop off their kids?
It is a different time.
It was a different time.
So we had 25 pre-service teachers in training from St. Mary's University that I was in charge of training. I was like the same age they were, or younger. But so it was a really interesting time.
And there was an exchange program with Mexico
Yes,
also.
exchange program with 25 Mexican teachers who came here and stayed a month, and then I was with a group of Texas and San Antonio teachers who went back and stayed for a month with these
How fabulous.
teachers. So.
And would you say that HemisFair set a course for you in your
Oh, definitely. I continued working in arts and education. I worked with Learning About Learning Educational Foundation, and I think a lot of San Antonio children were involved with that at
Yes.
Trinity University. And after that, worked with the San Antonio Children's Museum, the predecessor of the Dooseum, and also just then worked as a consultant
How
for a lot
grand.
of programs.
It really served you well then. What a great summer for you. Richard, so you ended up at the Girard exhibit.
Right.
And once you started there, of course, there are these beautiful little dioramas we heard about, and each one is a scene and it's folk art. And Alexander Girard came down. Did he bring other people with him?
He did. He brought Georgia O'Keeffe one
Oh,
time,
wonderful.
and I got the chance to watch her observe the dioramas that she had helped create. And she was an absolute perfectionist. She sat there in front of windows for an hour, 2 hours at a time. So it was a wonderful experience getting to do that.
How great. And do you have some great juicy stories for us about what happened?
I have a good one.
Okay.
The building that El Encanto del Pueblo was located in had a rail. It was in two portions. You entered from one way, going this way, and then there was a rail, and you exited down the other way.
It's like a ramp.
A ramp. Ramp.
A ramp,
And,
like a divided highway.
We were supposed to have. We were told we were having President Johnson and Lady Bird as guests, and they of course cleaned out the whole building and let nobody in there because nobody had a check on them or anything. And so we kept waiting, and we'd hear, they'll be there in 10 minutes. Okay. We'll be there in 10 more minutes. Okay. We'll be there in 30 minutes. Okay. And so I decided that I would go back around the building, and I was on the other side of the railing, And I heard this, he's here, they're here, she's here, they're here. And I jumped over it as I was going around, jumped over the railing, and I landed on the exit part of the enter part of the railing, and Lyndon and Lady Bird were coming up to the front. And before I could say anything, I was down on the floor with the Secret Service handcuffing me. And all the HemisFair executives were there, and they had all these little yellow jackets on, and they were going, don't do that, he's with us, he's got a jacket. And they kept me there for a couple of minutes, so it was a fun experience, but I don't know if I'd do it again.
But would you say that experience in some way or other colored your future as well?
Absolutely. I became a HemisFair, I don't know what you call it, but I lived at HemisFair my whole career. I went to New York for a little while and came back and opened what was called the Melodrama Theater, which is at the main gate of HemisFair. And then after that, I started the Magic Theater, and that's located at Beethoven Hall in HemisFair again. And I was 3 years running the artistic chair of Luminaria. We did it at HemisFair again. So I have a whole lifetime of experiences being at HemisFair. It's been a wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. How fabulous. Congratulations to all three of you for your great experiences. I want to bring Abby back on. So thousands of young people worked at HemisFair. In fact, the fair was run by all young people pretty much. Well, there were executives in offices, and then there were us. We were the face of the fair. We are the ones who visited with everyone who came, and we had so many great adventures over that. I believe, of course, there were friends who drove the monorail. I think we have a video of that somewhere. We had makeovers by Mademoiselle magazine. That was really a great time as well, if I remember. And then, Abby, you had a really special tour that you gave.
Yes, in July of the fair, Tiny Tim was scheduled to come and perform at the Municipal Auditorium in San Antonio, and there were several days of newspaper publicity for him. Not many people really knew who Tiny Tim was. They just knew he was sort of a curly-haired, falsetto, ukulele-playing folk singer. But I was assigned to accompany him from the airport and to take him through the fair. And I thought, oh, Tiny Tim, okay, tiptoe through the tulips. And it was a wonderful day. He was a genuinely delightful person, very kind and very genuine. And I thought, you know, he really is what he appears to be. He's a very gentle person. And the next day after he performed, the headlines in the newspaper were, San Antonio crowd discovers Tiny Tim is real.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a good thing.
He really was real.
He really was real.
Instead of a fake.
So we had a grand time, and there were places that we partied. When the bands performed, we danced. We tried to get the audience into things. We escorted great people around. It was a really wonderful time. We had a couple of staged events, and one was called The Millionth Visitor. And Abby, that happened to you. So if you'll stick around a minute, we're going to look at that video, and we can talk about it briefly.
As a VIP guide on May 14, they came to me and asked me to go to Gate 3 because they were going to take the millionth visitor to the fair and give them a tour. So they were waiting for the turnstile to turn to 1 million. So we were there at the gate, and it was a baby and the baby's parents that came through, and they said, this is the millionth visitor to the fair. So it was Anita Lynn and her son Mark, her baby Mark. So we toured the fair, and 4 years later, I took a job teaching at St. Mary's Hall Montessori. My son was 3, he entered the Montessori, and she was his teacher. And I hadn't seen her since that day at the fair. And she recognized me and she said, you're the fair guide. You took us on our tour when we were the millionth visitor to the fair. And actually, I'll be honest with you, the director that was with me said, you see that baby? He's going to be the millionth visitor. They wanted a baby. And so, yes, then there were bands, and they got a lot of gifts and certificates for San Antonio, and it turned out they were from San Antonio. So it was a big celebration for the 1 millionth visitor to the fair.
Any final thoughts you want to share with us about the importance of HemisFair in your life and for our city?
Well, the final thought, if you'd like a personal thought,
Yes.
it has fate and Cupid sort of collaborated to bring a young St. Mary's University professor to the fair to speak at Project Y, where Susie Mundy was.
Right.
And he was quite young and attractive, and the young people liked him. And I was stuck in an information booth that night, and he and a friend came by and invited me to join them at the Falstaff House.
Which we love to go
Which we
there.
love to go to the Falstaff House for a beer. And that was the beginning of a 50-year love life.
And you got married.
We
as a
married
result of that.
on Thanksgiving
Thanksgiving
Day.
Day. Well, congratulations for that
Thank
and
you.
for all the contributions you made to HemisFair and continue to San Antonio. So as we're getting ready to the end of our program here, I wanted to hear from Richard. What happened after the fair? What happened?
Well, I think what happened was that we partied too much. No,
The city?
no, we. I think that the situation was that everybody wanted the fair to be redone and go on, but the problem came up that nobody had the willpower anymore to go through.
Everybody was
what we'd
tired.
already done. Everyone was tired. Yeah.
There was no
And
money.
There was no money around, and so it got put on the shelf in the city hall. And I think probably besides the Instituto and some other things, the Magic Theater and Melodrama have been the only places that have used it. Now we see a whole revival of HemisFair in a totally different way, and I think that's a great thing. It's a place where Magic Theater can grow, and where I was there yesterday, and there were thousands of children in the new playground. And so I think it has a great future, but it's
How
going to take
wonderful.
a lot of caring about the fact that we're trying to build a great park and a great city, and parks always have a lot of green space.
Yes.
And so we hope that
That will-
continues.
That's
Absolutely.
very good thoughts. So Abby, you and I went to lunch a few days ago with a group, and we met this young woman who
Yes.
was, tell us about that.
We were trying to find a restaurant to eat, and this lovely young girl was walking beside us with her cell phone, and she said, "Oh, I know one that's open." So she
Because everybody was closed 'cause
everything
it
was
was a
closed
holiday.
because it was a holiday and it was a Monday or
Right.
something. And so we said, "Oh," so we followed her, and then we invited her to join us for lunch. And we said, "We're all here. We're taking a tour of our HemisFair, and we're working on a project." And she said, "What is HemisFair?" And she worked one
wonderful.
block from the fair. She had just graduated from St. Mary's University in San Antonio, and she was from Texas, from the Valley. And I was stunned that she had no idea what HemisFair was. So I knew that, thank goodness, we were going to be retelling the hidden stories, and it would
Exactly.
come back into the public.
Well, and that set me to thinking about this young man. Everybody welcome Christopher Medina, who as a high school kid began collecting memorabilia. He's a history buff and loves to collect information and things. Tell us just a little bit about why HemisFair and how did you get excited about that?
Well, I grew up here in San Antonio, and I used to go to the theme parks a lot, SeaWorld and Fiesta, Texas. And another big love of mine is local history. And about 2008, 2006 or so, those two interests came about to where I started learning about the Tower of the Americas.
You weren't even born during HemisFair.
Oh, no. No, I was
Your
born
mom, I understand your mom was only like 9 or 10 years old.
at the time of the fair. That's
Yes.
correct. I was born in the late 70s in Wisconsin. But at any rate, so around 2006, I started collecting memorabilia. The first thing I ever collected was the Jim Beam decanter. And from there, I started collecting a few other things. And in 2008, I was with a friend of mine, and I was telling him how it was a shame how I could not go on the internet and find any resources on HemisFair about the history, because I wanted to learn more. And so he says, well, why not? You're very savvy with computers, and you like talking about the history of the fair, so why not just go out and create a web page? So over about the course of 3 years, brainstorm and programming, and in 2011 I launched my website to share my growing collection and knowledge of all things HemisFair.
And now you've been involved in the park planning and some of the other activities?
That's correct. I had a lot of great fun meeting a lot of great people like yourself to learn about the oral history of the fair.
Right.
I've attended a lot of public workshops when it comes about the planning, not only for the 50th anniversary, but for Iguana, which opened in 2015. Public workshops, which talked about Civic Park, which is, I think, slated for 2020, and then Tower Park after that.
So we wish all young people were as interested in HemisFair as you are. And that's why we were so excited to share this story tonight with Hidden Histories. Because unless our young people in San Antonio know what our city's history is and how the last 50 years has really taken us on a particular course of economic development, cultural awakening, of friendship building, and many, many, many opportunities for new directions for our city. And young people are voting, young people need to be involved. And so we found it very interesting that a young person like you, who wasn't even born during HemisFair, would find it intriguing. And so we're going to ask you to continue to work with us on spreading the word of the Hidden Histories and make sure that everyone learns about HemisFair. And we have just one more little thing, an invitation to join all of us in celebrating the 50th anniversary of HemisFair, and I believe we have a video about that. Let's turn to the screen.
So opening on April 6th, the 50th anniversary of HemisFair itself, we have two exhibits coming. One, of course, is Viva HemisFair, which is 50 years looking back on HemisFair and what it did to San Antonio, how it changed things permanently. The other part is Viva ITC, which is 50 years of the Institute's service to the state. So we're doing the recognition of our Texas Star Heritage Award recipients. We're doing the 1968 flashback and a fashion show with the styles of the 1960s. And we flash up forward to today with the brand new Dome Show. We're going to be showing where we came from, where we are, and what's next.
So if you're interested in any of that, we have a Facebook page for the HemisFair former employees, and you can find information on that regularly. It's called HemisFair 68 Former Employees, and we welcome you to come and visit our page. And we invite you also to look for the future Hidden Histories programs. The next one is going to be on Monday, April 2nd. And it's called Mega Corazon, and we are going to listen to some of the top poets in the city on that particular day. So thank you everyone for participating tonight, for coming to learn about HemisFair. Think about what the future can be. Think about the kind of direction that HemisFair 68 has taken us, about its stamp, its mark that it's left on San Antonio over the past 50 years, and let's wonder what the next 50 will look like. Good night, everyone.
Well, one of the things that was wonderful was going to the Texas Pavilion, which became the Institute of Texan Cultures, of course, and they had this dome show, which I still have, but it was a different show now. It was the first time I'd ever seen that kind of a multimedia exhibit where you would see all these great pictures of Texans from different cultures and images of the state, and it was truly inspiring, and besides that, it was cool. So a lot of times I was working outside at the fair, so at my lunch hour I would come in and I would lie on the floor and watch the dome show.
We started out with a sky lift that goes over the grounds, and it was beautiful. A lot of people would try and see a bird's eye view of the fair. But I got to drive the monorail, so I was one of the many monorail drivers. My sister got me the job. She was somebody in the administration. She got a little brother job, so The mini monorail was new and different, and it was above ground, and it was a one railroad system that went all the way through the park, so people got to see everything. We always had long lines waiting, and we had some of the most beautiful dressed girls to help people in and out of the cars, so I'm sure a lot of people went for that reason as well. My background is biology. I was a major in biology, and I had a job at the Parks and Wildlife in Rockport, Texas. I gave that position up so I could come here and have a fun summer job at HemisFair. Once in a lifetime adventure.
This building here is the Women's Pavilion. It celebrated women's contributions to society. The theme in the guidebook says, man may have conquered the world, but it was women who civilized it. A couple of neat things about the building is that it actually served as part of the exit strategy for the fair as a student union building when this site was proposed for the initial location of UT San Antonio when it was signed into law the following year, 1969. When I interviewed the original director, Sherry Wagner, she told me about how when they approached her for her building, they asked her, do you want your building to be a temporary building like some of the other new structures, or do you want to do permanent? And she says, well, let's do it permanent. That way it could serve as a future student union building, but also it satisfies urban renewal agency requirement, as well as the BIE of having a certain percentage of your buildings as permanent structures.
All right, I'm just going to go.
So these wonderful houses are all that remain of the neighborhood that was here before this became HemisFair. Most of these houses had been built in the 1800s, and the families were moved during the urban renewal process. So during HemisFair, they were restored. There were over 200 houses, I believe, that were here originally, and only 22 were left. And the Conservation Society worked really hard to protect them and to help restore them. And they became restaurants and bars and fun places to go in the evening, wouldn't you say?
We never went home. We just worked all day long, and then we would go to a place like the Sir John Falstaff House, and we would listen to a wonderful folk singer, Lofton Klein. Sit there for hours on end.
And we'd go home at midnight when the fair closed.
Fair closed. Here's where he talks about Project Y, which was a fabulous child-centered program where Susie Mundy worked.
I remember, didn't you have an amphitheater and you had concerts out there?
There were concerts.
Because I remember...
Lead Belly concerts. I think at least in theory the amphitheater operated 14 hours a day. So it was total programming. It was an amazing kind of feat of programming.
Charlie Cottrell spoke there. He was a young professor at St. Mary's University.
And that's where you met him.
I met him, and that was 49 years ago.
And you're still married.
This was the elevated walkway, so you could go on an upper kind of deck level, and they saved this few of them, but it was an elevated walkway.
Beethoven Hall, which is just around the corner, was La Terna Magica, the most amazing show you've ever seen. The actors would step out of the film and right onto the stage, and then they'd jump back into the film again. It was fabulous to see. And it was closed for a little while after HemisFair, and then it was reborn as the Magic Theater, and now thousands of children go there every year. Behind me to my right is another one of the many sculptures that were here at HemisFair and continue to stay as part of our beautiful legacy of HemisFair. I'm thrilled, and this one happens to be in front of UNAM, and UNAM has been here 73 years, and they moved into this building after HemisFair closed, and it became a very natural place for them to be, right next to the Instituto Cultural de México. This wonderful embossed piece of metal has the logo of HemisFair, which starts out as the world, and then people came west to the world, and then they met with the people who were here, and they had a confluence of cultures. Isn't that the most amazing and beautiful logo? And to see it on the wall of the Instituto Cultural de México today, it just brings back so many memories. I'm just thrilled to see that the logo has been preserved for 50 years so far.